US-China relations have evolved from tense standoffs to a complex mix of intensifying diplomacy, growing international rivalry, and increasingly intertwined economies. September 2008. China surpasses Japan to become the largest holder of US debt, or treasuries, at around $600 billion. The growing interdependence between the US and Chinese economies becomes evident as a financial crisis threatens the global economy, fueling concerns over US-China economic imbalances. August 2010. China surpasses Japan as the world's second-largest economy after it is valued at $1.33 trillion for the second quarter of 2010, slightly above Japan's $1.28 trillion for that year. China is on track to overtake the United States as the world's #1 economy by 2027, according to Goldman Sachs chief economist Jim O'Neill. At the start of 2011, China reports a total GDP of $5.88 trillion for 2010, compared to Japan's $5.47 trillion. February 2012. The U.S. trade deficit with China rises from $273.1 billion in 2010 to an all-time high of $295.5 billion in 2011. The increase accounts for three-quarters of the growth in the U.S. trade deficit for 2011. In March, the United States, the EU, and Japan file a request for consultations with China at the World Trade Organization over its restrictions on exporting rare earth metals. The United States and its allies contend China's quota violates international trade norms, forcing multinational firms that use the metals to relocate to China. China calls the move rash and unfair, while vowing to defend its rights in trade disputes. April. Blind Chinese dissident Chen Guangcheng escapes house arrest in Shandong province on April 22 and flees to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. U.S. diplomats negotiate an agreement with Chinese officials allowing Chen to stay in China and study law in a city close to the capital. However, after Chen moves to Beijing, he changes his mind and asks to take shelter in the United States. The development threatens to undermine US-China diplomatic ties, but both sides avert a crisis by allowing Chen to visit the United States as a student, rather than as an asylum seeker. May 2014. A U.S. court indicts 5 Chinese hackers, allegedly with ties to China's People's Liberation Army, on charges of stealing trade technology from U.S. companies. In response, Beijing suspends its cooperation in the US-China Cybersecurity Working Group. In June 2015, US authorities signal that there is evidence that Chinese hackers are behind the major online breach of the Office of Personnel Management and the theft of data from 22 million current and former federal employees. May 2015. At the 14th Annual Shangri-La Dialogue on Asian Security, U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter calls on China to halt its controversial land reclamation efforts in the South China Sea, saying that the United States opposes any further militarization of the disputed territory. Ahead of the conference, U.S. officials say that images from U.S. naval surveillance provide evidence that China is placing military equipment on a chain of artificial islands, despite Beijing's claims that construction is mainly for civilian purposes. March 2018. The Trump administration announces sweeping tariffs on Chinese imports, worth at least $50 billion, in response to what the White House alleges is Chinese theft of U.S. technology and intellectual property. Coming on the heels of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, the measures target goods including clothing, shoes, and electronics, and restrict some Chinese investment in the United States. China imposes retaliatory measures in early April on a range of U.S. products, stoking concerns of a trade war between the world's largest economies. The move marks a hardening of President Trump's approach to China after high-profile summits with President-11 in April and November 2017. July, the Trump administration imposes fresh tariffs totaling $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. More than 800 Chinese products in the industrial and transport sectors, as well as goods such as televisions and medical devices, will face a 25% import tax. China retaliates with its own tariffs on more than 500 US products. The reprisal, also valued around $34 billion, targets commodities such as beef, dairy, seafood, and soybeans. President Trump and members of his administration believe that China is ripping off the United States, taking advantage of free trade rules to the detriment of US firms operating in China. Beijing criticizes the Trump administration's moves as trade bullying and cautions that tariffs could trigger global market unrest. December, Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Chinese telecom and electronics company Huawei, is arrested in Canada at the United States' request. The U.S. Justice Department alleges Huawei and Meng violated trade sanctions against Iran and committed fraud and requests her extradition. In apparent retaliation, China detains 2 Canadian citizens, who officials accuse of undermining China's national security. Calling Meng's arrest a serious political incident, Chinese officials demand her immediate release. U.S. officials emphasize an unbiased and apolitical legal process, but President Trump implies Meng's charges could be used as leverage in ongoing U.S.-China trade talks. March 2019. Amid legal proceedings against Meng, Huawei sues the United States in a separate lawsuit for banning U.S. federal agencies from using the telecom giant's equipment. In a battle with Beijing for technological supremacy, the Trump administration launches an aggressive campaign warning other countries not to use Huawei equipment to build 5G networks, claiming the Chinese government could use the company to spy. May, after trade talks break down, the Trump administration raises tariffs from 10 to 25% on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. China retaliates by announcing plans to increase tariffs on $60 billion worth of American goods. President Trump says he believes the high costs imposed by tariffs will force China to make a deal favorable to the United States, while China's foreign ministry says the United States has extravagant expectations. Days later, the Trump administration bans U.S. companies from using foreign-made telecommunications equipment that could threaten national security, a move believed to target Huawei. The U.S. Commerce Department also adds Huawei to its foreign entity blacklist. August, after China's central bank lets the yuan weaken significantly, the Trump administration designates China a currency manipulator. The designation, applied to China for the first time since 1994, is mainly symbolic, but it comes less than a week after Trump announced higher tariffs on $300 billion worth of goods. That means everything the United States imports from China now faces taxes. Beijing warns that the designation will trigger financial market turmoil. January 2020. President Trump and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He signed the agreement, a breakthrough in the nearly 2-year trade war between the world's 2 largest economies. The deal relaxes some U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports and commits China to buying an additional $200 billion worth of American goods, including agricultural products and cars, over 2 years. China also pledges to enforce intellectual property protections. But the agreement maintains most tariffs and does not mention the Chinese government's extensive subsidies, a long-time concern of the United States, though Trump says these could be tackled in a future deal. Days before the signing, the United States dropped its designation of China as a currency manipulator. The Trump administration bars all non-US citizens who recently visited mainland China from entering the United States amid an outbreak of a new coronavirus that was first reported in the Chinese city of Wuhan. Leading officials in both China and the United States blame the other side for the pandemic. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson claims without evidence that the US military brought the virus to China, while President Trump makes repeated references to the Chinese virus, which he says spread because of failures by the Chinese government. March. The Chinese government announces it will expel at least 13 journalists from 3 US newspapers, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post, whose press credentials are set to expire in 2020. Beijing also demands that those outlets, as well as Time and Voice of America, share information with the government about their operations in China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says the moves are in response to the US government's decision earlier in the year to limit the number of Chinese journalists from 5 state-run media outlets in the United States to 100, down from 160, and designate those outlets as foreign missions. Although the new Cold War is playing out across the world, its geographic center of gravity is the Indo-Pacific, not Europe, because the epicenter of global commerce and trade has moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific, reflecting Asia's rise and Europe's decline. The United States and China are both Pacific powers, so their rivalry will be felt most keenly in the Indo-Pacific, particularly at sea, where their interests collide, and there are several potential triggers for military confrontation. North Korea and the East and South China Seas are the most likely candidates. But Taiwan and Hong Kong are potentially arenas for conflict too, and not just because of their political significance. Taiwan is a critical technology producer for the United States and China. Hong Kong is China's financial portal to the world and the US dollar, which remains the dominant currency for international trade. China's expanding Belt and Road Initiative and continued assertions in the South China Sea also feed into its tensions with the US. The South China Sea is an important sea route for world trade where Beijing has claimed most of it as its own territory, even though other countries. On July, China ordered the United States to close its consulate in Chengdu in response to a US order for China to shut its Houston consulate, where staff packed up belongings watched by jeering protesters amid a sharp deterioration in relations between the world's 2 largest economies. US President Donald Trump's administration said the closing of the Houston consulate was aimed at protecting American intellectual property and personal information. To know more and get update with recent global news, visit the Reader's Planet official website.